Okay, let's see.
Number 14. The cave that started the case. The cave air burns your throat before your eyes adjust. Under your boots lies powdery bat guano, feet deep. Then shapes appear where fertilizer should be. Woven reeds, a duck decoy, a human bone. In 1911, that is how Lovelock Cave near Nevada entered the record. Not through a careful burial excavation, but through two guano miners tearing into a sealed dry cave and exposing a cache so rich that the University of California rushed in to salvage what was left. Over months in 1912, and again in 1924, archaeologists pulled out thousands of real artifacts and real human remains. After that, another version of the cave took over. Red-haired enemies from Paiute tradition, oversized skeletons, whispers that institutions made the evidence disappear. The problem starts there. If unusual remains kept reaching major collections for more than a century, why is almost none of it traceable now? In the later version, Lovelock is where the story turns vivid. A giant handprint on the cave wall, oversized sandals or robes, bones too large for ordinary people. A hostile ancient people, called the Si-Te-Cah, fused to the site until the whole cave sounds less like archaeology than a cleaned-up crime scene. But the first people inside that deposit did not arrive with notebooks and measuring tapes. They came with picks and sacks. Their names were David Pugh and James Hart. In 1911, they were mining guano, compressed bat waste sold as fertilizer. That matters because guano preserved the cave and wrecked it at the same time. The deposit was dry and deep. It sealed organic material that usually rots away. Baskets, textiles, decoys, cordage. But commercial extraction does not peel back layers carefully. It tears through them. The earliest testimony in the Lovelock record is damaged from the start. By the time archaeologists understood what was happening, shovels had already churned up the context. Spring, 1912. Alfred Kroeber at the University of California sent Llewellyn L. Loud to recover whatever the miners had not obliterated. Loud was not leading a Smithsonian expedition. He was a University of California archaeologist stepping into a cave that had already been opened, stripped, and partly scattered. He spent about 5 months there. What he and later excavators described was not minor. Roughly 10,000 objects are commonly associated with Loud's salvage alone. Later estimates pushed the total artifact mass to more than 20,000. Duck decoys, nets, matting, baskets, human remains. A real site, a major site, not a secret warehouse of impossible bones. The witness statement that matters most here is the published one. In 1924, M.R. Harrington returned for additional work. In 1929, Loud and Harrington published Lovelock Cave through the University of California Press. That report is the closest thing this story has to sworn testimony. It fixes dates, it fixes personnel, it fixes the institution. If the giant version began in the excavation itself, this is where it should show up. It does not. The cave's second life came in through a different door. Northern Paiute tradition includes accounts of the Si-Te-Cah, usually described as a hostile people. Later retellings attach them to Lovelock Cave specifically. Then, local storytelling, roadside versions, and fringe retellings started adding details with a very modern instinct for escalation. Red hair, cannibalism, huge skeletons, evidence suppressed by museums. The name stayed native, the proportions grew, the chain of custody fell apart. Here the accusation against the Smithsonian starts to wobble in a precise way. The cave used to argue institutional burial was excavated, documented, and published by the University of California. The Smithsonian appears mostly as a later magnet for giant skeleton suspicion in general, not as the primary excavator of Lovelock in particular. Before anyone asks where the Smithsonian hid the giants from this cave, the record asks something simpler. Which giants? From whose excavation? Under what catalog number? You can feel the pressure point immediately. Lovelock does contain real human remains. It does contain extraordinary preservation. It does contain a native conflict tradition, later linked to the cave. All of that is true, but one true layer does not authenticate every layer placed on top of it. If a giant handprint was observed during excavation, there should be a primary description. If oversized clothing was recovered as part of the archaeological record, there should be measurements, notes, or at least a plain mention in the 1912 or 1924 work, and in the 1929 report that followed. There is another reason this matters. In giant narratives, perishable objects do a lot of quiet work. Bones can be remeasured, photos can be checked for scale, but a robe, a sandal, a woven mat can be described loosely, displayed dramatically, and retold until large becomes impossibly large. Lovelock is exactly the kind of site where that mutation can happen. Dry caves preserve the materials that make legends feel touchable. You are not just hearing about a big skeleton, you are hearing about the things that person wore. So go back to the documents: Loud's salvage, Harrington's return, the 1929 publication, the summaries built from them. Archaeological overviews of the cave report human remains, but within normal human-size parameters. Smithsonian's own myth-busting on giant skeleton claims points the same way. No verified Smithsonian collection of Lovelock giants, no authenticated race of oversized people behind the story. Check the famous visual details against the primary excavation record, and they separate fast. The giant handprint does not appear as a documented feature in the primary excavation report. Neither does oversized clothing, described as belonging to giants. What the record preserves is stranger in a different way. A looted dry cave, 2 guano miners in 1911, University of California salvage in 1912, more work in 1924, and a 1929 report from Loud and Harrington. It documents real remains and thousands of artifacts. It does not document a giant handprint. It does not enter oversized clothing as giant evidence. Number 13. When the newspapers found giants. In 1890s Ohio, a skeleton could grow by the inch between breakfast and the evening edition. 7 feet in the ground became 8 feet in print, and by the time the clipping was recopied years later, it belonged to a vanished race. The bones usually did not travel nearly as far as the story did. A local burial could be turned into a national emergency by the headline alone. In the late 19th century, Ohio was already crowded with earthworks, village sites, and burial mounds tied to real indigenous histories. This was the same landscape that includes places like Serpent Mound and the Hopewell tradition. Newspapers found a more profitable version of that landscape. A labor crew cuts into a mound, a skull appears, a femur gets held against the shovel handle. Someone estimates 7 feet, or a little more. By the next day, the article has a headline, a note of alarm, and just enough precision to sound careful. This is where the modern giant story starts moving faster. One Ohio skeleton, in particular, was later said to have been measured by a respected expert. Not guessed, measured. That difference matters if you were trying to answer the larger accusation behind this whole story. If the Smithsonian really received giant skeletons for more than a century, why can almost none of them be found today? In Ohio, the first question is simpler. Did an expert actually produce the famous measurement, or did the number come from a reporter and harden into fact through repetition? The myth version is easy to spot because it arrives fully dressed. The mound opens. The bones are unusually large. Grave goods appear beside them: shell beads, pipes, copper ornaments, sometimes bells. Those ordinary archaeological details get used like stage props, as if serious burial furniture must belong to a giant. Then the article adds authority. A doctor saw it. A professor inspected it. An expert confirmed it. Later retellings can strip away everything except the height and the credential. At the same time, the evidence moving through Ohio was heading in the opposite direction. In 1889, Cyrus Thomas published The Problem of the Ohio Mounds. 5 years later came his Report on the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology, a 742-page Smithsonian publication covering mound evidence across roughly 24 states. These were not buried records. They were printed, circulated, and now sit online for anyone to download. That openness should matter. Instead, in the age of keyword searching, accessibility can feed suspicion when readers go looking for giants, do not find the word used the way they expect, and treat the absence as proof that something was renamed or suppressed. Thomas was doing something more specific than hiding or denying. He was defining categories, fixing authorship, setting interpretation, and determining which evidence counted as archaeological description and which counted as rumor. He did not simply wave away giant claims. He rebuilt the Ohio mounds into a cultural and tribal history using burial position, mound form, associated artifacts, and repeated excavation patterns. He treated the dead as archaeological evidence, not newspaper bait. That is the collision at the center of the Ohio giant myth. On one side, local reports describe skeletons of 7 feet or more. Often they come with no specimen number, no scaled photograph, no chain of custody, and no surviving bones anyone can check. On the other side, Smithsonian-linked researchers publish excavation summaries, textile studies, artifact descriptions, and mound surveys in plain view. In 1883, the Smithsonian even published a report on a fragment of cloth taken from a mound in Ohio. The paper trail is public, searchable, and ordinary. Yet that very ordinariness creates a modern vulnerability. Readers can mistake a visible archive for a coded one, especially when they expect dramatic terms, and instead find technical language, distribution lists, and burial descriptions. So where does the famous expert measurement usually come from? Most often, it comes from a sentence that changes shape every time it is retold. A newspaper may say the skeleton was measured in the presence of a local authority, or that a doctor pronounced it of extraordinary size, or that the remains were estimated at over 7 feet. Those are not the same claim. A rough estimate becomes an examination becomes a measurement becomes the verdict of a named specialist. Then the clipping gets detached from its local context and reused as proof that trained men saw impossible bodies and institutions later made them disappear. You can feel how persuasive that becomes if you stand at the scene. You are at the edge of an opened mound in Ohio. Dirt lies in ridges. Ribs lift out of dark soil. Neighbors gather before any careful excavation grid exists. A reporter needs a column by nightfall. The burial is real. The grave goods are real. The mound is real. But the exact height of the person in the grave may already be slipping away. Bones still in earth are not laid out on a measuring table, and loose phrasing is about to become permanent. Later giant narratives rely on that pattern. Not a stable specimen, but a stable sentence. Ohio was not producing nothing. Real excavations were turning up real burials. Some finds later folded into giant lore were ordinary interments accompanied by shell beads, pipes, copper bells, and other goods entirely consistent with native mound contexts. The mounds were never empty fantasy. They were full of evidence. One interpretation said that evidence belonged to identifiable native societies. The other said it pointed to a lost race dramatic enough to fill columns and sell papers. And the risk does not stop with bad newspaper habits. Once an ambiguous line attaches a height claim to a doctor, professor, or Smithsonian-connected observer, modern retellings can promote the attribution itself into evidence. A cited expert becomes a substitute for a specimen. The chain no longer needs bones at all. It only needs a clipped sentence, a prestigious name, and a reader willing to treat uncertain wording as institutional testimony. That is how a vague 19th century phrase in Ohio can end up supporting a 21st century cover-up claim about the Smithsonian, even when no giant skeleton, no catalog entry, and no verifiable measurement survives. So the Ohio case does not really close with a solved newspaper exaggeration. It opens onto a larger problem. In the records that survive, what usually survives securely is the report, not the measurement. The authority, not the method. The clipping, not the bones. On the ground, in the mound itself, there is a burial. In the archive, there is often only a headline. And once a headline can stand in for missing bones, the next danger is larger than Ohio. What happens when an institution's own catalog language, stripped from context and read through suspicion, starts doing the same thing? Number 12. The skull with extra teeth. Found in Si-Te-Cah Township, Noble County, Ohio, 3 skeletons of unusual size, the jaws containing a double row of teeth. That line survived when almost nothing else did. No field notes, no scaled drawing, no photograph. Just a compact 19th century claim, cut loose from its original ground like a bone without a label. In 1872, somewhere in Si-Te-Cah Township, local diggers opened one of the mounds scattered across southeastern Ohio. Inside were human remains large enough to impress the men standing at the edge of the pit. The account that later fed giant lore says there were 3 skeletons. It says the bones were unusually large, and it says the strangest feature was in the mouth, double rows of teeth in both upper and lower jaws. The hard numbers are few. 1 year, 1872. 1 place, Si-Te-Cah Township, Noble County. 3 skeletons, 2 jaws, and almost nothing else a modern investigator would ask for. No named excavator in the commonly circulated text, no physician attached to the find, no anatomist, no mound number, no measured femur. No cranial dimensions, no museum inventory, no Smithsonian accession trail. Reports like this change shape through repetition. A local burial becomes a giant. An odd phrase turns into a biological impossibility. A story with no custody chain gets retold as if some institution must have taken the evidence afterward. But the first problem sits inside the clipping itself. What did the teeth description mean? And does anything survive beyond the newspaper summary to test it? Noble County lies in one of the most heavily disturbed mound landscapes in the Ohio Valley. After the Civil War, this happened again and again. Farmers plowed into embankments. Road crews cut through rises in the earth. Amateur antiquarians opened burials with shovels, tape measures, and a strong appetite for the marvelous. Real human remains came out of real indigenous mounds, but the trip from mound to print was often much shorter than the trip from mound to science. Take the dental line by itself. Double rows of teeth. Today it lands with a very specific image. Shark teeth. Extra ranks of enamel behind the first set. Something non-human. 19th century language was looser than modern giant books like to admit. Double teeth could mean molars. It could mean upper and lower dentition. It could mean crowded or unusual eruption. A reporter could have heard a digger describe a broad jaw with heavy back teeth and turned it into spectacle before sunset. Andy White has pointed out how often this happens in giant literature. Old wording gets reheard by modern readers as pathology or monstrosity, when the original phrase may have been ordinary, imprecise, or both. That shift matters here. The Noble County story is carried almost entirely by one anatomical flourish. Remove the teeth, and what remains is another rough, mound-opening anecdote from 1870s Ohio. Read the teeth in the most dramatic modern way, and the report stops sounding like a burial and starts sounding like evidence of a hidden race. The missing pieces are still the central fact. No preserved skull has been publicly linked to this specific account. No verified museum specimen. No published anatomical follow-up. The Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology documented many mound excavations in the broader region, but this Noble County item does not appear as a Smithsonian-controlled specimen with a catalog number you can pull, inspect, and match to the claim. That is the hinge in the larger question running through this whole story. If the Smithsonian received unusual remains for more than a century, where are they? In this case, the pressure falls somewhere earlier, at the moment of recording. The geography helps, but only a little. The 1876 Illustrated Atlas of Noble County, published 4 years after the reported discovery, fixes the county landscape in time. Roads, townships, property lines. It shows the world the report came from. It does not tell you which mound was opened, who opened it, where the bones went, or whether anyone with anatomical training ever saw the jaw that carried the impossible detail. That changes the shape of the story. In modern giant lore, this skull enters as if it were a lost specimen. On the surviving evidence, it may never have become a specimen at all. It may have stayed what it first appears to have been, a newspaper item separated from a burial almost as soon as the burial was disturbed. You can feel that in the paperwork, or in the lack of it. Authentic excavated remains, even badly handled ones, usually leave secondary traces. A collector's note, a county history, a museum shelf mark, a named professor asking for shipment. Here, the trail thins at once. The dramatic detail survives. The descriptive frame does not. There is no skull to re-examine, so the phrase cannot be tested against the object that would settle it. Was it supernumerary teeth? A developmental anomaly? Misobservation? Embellishment added in retelling? The report does not give enough, and no surviving specimen is there to answer. So the local loop closes in the least theatrical way possible. The claim is an unusual dental structure. The check is whether any anatomical description or actual specimen survives beyond the newspaper summary. None has been publicly tied to this Noble County case. No named examiner, no preserved jaw, no accession record connecting it to the Smithsonian. Just a line from 1872, a county on the map, and a mouth no one can reopen. By evening, the pit would have looked ordinary again. Loose soil, trampled grass, men walking away, and somewhere in print, 2 words carried the whole story: double teeth. Number 11. The skeleton in the doctor's hallway. On April 25, 1934, a short item out of Steelville, Missouri, described a set of human bones so long they turned a cave rumor into a town exhibit. The remains had been found near a cave about 7 miles from town. Later retellings would call it Puckett Cave. For years, one detail stayed alive above all the others: 8 feet. The 8-foot exhibit vanished before anyone cataloged it. A boy is out looking for arrowheads in 1933, somewhere beyond Steelville, in the Ozarks, near a cave opening cut into the rock. That is how the story enters the record. Not through an excavation log, not through a coroner's measurement sheet, through newspaper copy, then local memory, then microfilm. The claim takes hold fast, because the bones were not only said to have been found, but displayed. In some retellings, they end up in a doctor's office hallway, where locals could walk past them and judge the scale for themselves. That is the local loop here. The article says the skeleton remained in a hallway. The missing piece is anything that locked that down afterward. A later photograph, a museum inventory, a town record, anything proving it was really there. The name attached to that hallway is Dr. R. C. Parker. Later summaries say an 8-foot skeleton was displayed in his office in 1933. It is the kind of detail giant stories love, because it pulls the bones out of the ground and into a familiar room. Not a distant mound, not a vanished train car, a hallway, fluorescent light, coat hooks, patients passing by on their way to an exam room. The image is easy to picture and easy to remember. The first hard surface under the story is the newspaper date, April 25th, 1934, the Springfield Daily News. That matters because it gives the case a fixed point. Steelville was real. The article was real. A skeleton near a cave outside town was being discussed in print less than a year after the reported 1933 discovery. This is not pure campfire folklore. It leaves paper. Then the trail shifts. Decades later, a Missouri State Archives newsletter mentions Smithsonian files on the Puckett Cave skeleton. Not just a rumor about files, a reference to files, with the cave named. It also mentions a State Museum research assistant named Chapman in connection with the case. Stories like this usually need that kind of institutional echo and rarely get it. Somewhere, at some point, enough of this existed to generate correspondence. But correspondence is not custody. A file can preserve a clipping, a letter, a request for information, a field note, even a polite dismissal. It can prove that someone at the Smithsonian knew the story existed. By itself, it cannot prove the bones were shipped, measured, accessioned, hidden, or destroyed. Then the floor starts to give way. The photograph that circulates in modern giant circles is said to show Les Eaton, described as a 6-foot man, lying beside the skeleton for scale. If authentic, that would be the visual anchor this case has always needed. A body, a comparison figure, a rough test of whether 8 feet was fantasy or only an exaggerated estimate. But the image enters the case through later retellings, not through a formal archive tied to the discovery. No excavation report attaches it to the find. No museum record appears with it. No original caption from 1933 or 1934 has surfaced publicly to settle where it was taken, who staged it, or whether the bones in the frame are even the same bones described near Steelville. The image feeds the legend and weakens the proof at the same time. Now put yourself in that doctor's hallway. A full human skeleton truly remains on display there, even briefly. What should survive? A local photograph, a town paper note, an estate inventory, a county museum mention, a medical office anecdote pinned to a date. Something. Steelville is not Atlantis. This was the 1930s, not prehistory. Yet the modern chain to the display is mostly verbal. The hallway survives as a sentence. Still, this is not nothing. The Missouri State Archives reference is the strongest paper trail in the story so far because it points in 2 directions at once, locally to Missouri researchers and nationally to Smithsonian files. The case touched institutions large enough to leave records. It was not only a tall tale passed between porches, but the surviving public traces stop at the edge of the one fact people most want confirmed. The files are mentioned. The conclusion inside them is not. Did Smithsonian staff record a measured stature? Did they identify the remains as Native American cave burial material? Did they decide the 8-foot figure came from a body-length estimate, a disturbed skeleton, a bad scale comparison, or newspaper inflation? Or did they simply preserve correspondence about a story already circulating in Crawford County? The paper trail reaches the file cabinet, then goes quiet. That silence matters because the Smithsonian's public collections database sits on more than 18.7 million records. If the Steelville skeleton had entered the institution as a retained specimen, under a discoverable label, that would be the obvious place to start. But an absent public hit does not solve the case either. Records can be incomplete. Human remains may be listed under different descriptive terms. Some materials were never accessioned as permanent collections. Some cases never advanced beyond correspondence at all. So the story tightens around one man's hallway and one missing bridge. Dr. Parker gives the bones a room. Chapman gives them a research trail. The Missouri State Archives gives them a documentary shadow. The Smithsonian gives them a file. None of those, as publicly available today, gives them an inventory number tied to an 8-foot human skeleton from Puckett Cave. That closes the local loop in the least dramatic way possible. Later local records do not publicly confirm the hallway display with a photograph, museum inventory, or surviving specimen record. What remains is a newspaper report, a named doctor, a cave near Steelville, and a Missouri State Archives note saying Smithsonian files existed on the Puckett Cave skeleton. Number 10. A real excavation, not a newspaper legend. June 1958. Crescent Bottom, Marshall County, West Virginia. Donald W. Dragoo of the Carnegie Museum cuts into a burial mound a few miles southwest of Moundsville, with the Ohio River close by and a site number already fixed to the place, 46MR7. This is a controlled excavation. Floors, tombs, cremations, grave goods. 54 burials inside a stratified Adena mound that later entered the literature as one of the opening case studies in Dragoo's 1963 monograph, Mounds for the Dead, a 315-page museum publication. Those numbers matter only if they can pin the claim down. 1958 fixes the field season, 46MR7 fixes the place, and the 315 pages determine whether the famous height is a documented anatomical estimate, a burial length observation, or a number that drifted in later retelling. That difference matters because giant lore wants exactly this kind of case. An archaeologist in the field, a mound with a site number, a book on the shelf. At the center sits one measurement that traveled much farther than the burial ever did, a reported height of about 7 feet, often repeated online as roughly 7.04 feet, sometimes rounded to 7 feet 2 inches, attached to a skeleton with heavy long bones. The testimony starts there. It does not end there. Dragoo was not a fringe excavator. He worked with Carnegie's anthropology section from 1952 to 1977, and later became chief curator. Yale's EHRAF, which indexed the Crescent material later, rates the document as excellent primary data and excellent secondary data. The mound itself is described as virtually intact and representing 2 periods of interment. So when giant claim websites pull a line out of Crescent, they are not inventing the site. They are reaching into a legitimate excavation and lifting the one detail with the most charge. But even the date begins to slide. Popular retellings often call this the 1959 Crescent Mound skeleton. EHRAF gives Dragoo's field season as June through August of 1958. 1959 appears in some bibliographies because of preliminary reporting, but the major published source is 1963. That sounds minor, almost clerical. It is not. If the claim hangs on a 1959 citation that only echoes a preliminary notice, while the 1963 monograph gives the burial differently, then the inflation is traceable. A 1-year drift would expose a source failure, people repeating a number from summary mention rather than from the full excavation record. You can see why the number sticks. 7 feet is clean. 7.04 sounds even better because it feels measured, clinical, settled. But those are not the same claim. One is memorable, the other pretends to precision, and precision raises the stakes. If 7.04 feet were a verified anatomical stature, not merely a grave-length figure, then Dragoo's monograph should support it in a way later writers could not miss. A specimen description, a measurement method, a plate, a table, or an explicit physical anthropology note. If none of that appears where it should, then the authority of the number comes from repetition, not documentation. At Crescent, the context is less dramatic than giant lore wants, and more useful than rumor ever is. Dragoo did not present the burial as proof of a lost race. He placed it inside a Dina mortuary sequence, burial practice, and human physical variation. The large skeleton appears in context, surrounded by the plain details conspiracy retellings usually cut away. The mound was not one oversized body. It was a layered mortuary site with repeated use, structure, and sequence. That is why this case survives. An actual archaeologist handled it, and the paperwork stayed attached. The Smithsonian's role here is mostly atmospheric. It hangs over mound archaeology in the public imagination because Smithsonian scholars published enormous amounts of work on Eastern earthworks and burial mounds. But Cresap was a Carnegie Museum project, later cataloged by Yale, cited in West Virginia archaeology bibliographies, and discussed openly enough that modern giant websites could mine it for quotations. The accusation narrows here. The problem is not disappearance. The problem is overstatement inside a documented case. So the witness is the record itself. It confirms the excavation, the mound, the broad context, and that a large individual was noted. What it does not automatically confirm is what kind of measurement the famous number represents. Was it a living stature estimate derived from anatomy? Was it the engraved length of an extended burial? Was it shaped by body position, preservation, or the dimensions of the tomb? Did 7.04 feet appear first in Dragoo's own wording? Or did it harden later as someone converted about 7 feet into a false exactitude? Those are not cosmetic questions. They decide whether Cresap is evidence of an unusually tall person within known variation, or evidence of how a real archaeological record gets sharpened into something bigger than itself. This is where the monograph matters more than the myth. A burial plate can show posture. A measurement note can separate skeletal extent from estimated stature. A specimen entry can reveal whether heavy, long bones came from direct osteological analysis or from a looser field description. If the printed plate, table, or catalog language does not carry the 7.04-foot precision, then the number's strongest credential disappears. So what becomes of the skeleton itself? Not the legend, the chain of custody. Unlike the cases that evaporate into hearsay, Cresap leaves a museum trail. The excavation was published. The site remained in the archaeological record. The remains entered the ordinary machinery of curation, citation, and later, in many cases, repatriation law and collection management. That does not make every detail easy to inspect from a search bar today. It does mean the famous story is attached to a real professional context, and that is where the tension should stay. The mound is real, the excavation is real, the large burial is real. But the most repeated number still hangs on a narrower question than giant lore admits. When the 7.04-foot figure first enters print, does it appear on Dragoo's plate or specimen record as an actual stature claim? Or does it enter the custody trail later, after the burial had already become a better story than the page that was supposed to anchor it? Number 9. The train that allegedly carried the bones away. A documented excavation gives you a skeleton, measurements, field notes, a museum trail. But on the upper Mississippi, in December 1868, the paper trail arrives before the bones do. If a body almost 10 feet 10 inches long was really cut out of granite near Sauk Rapids, where did it go, and who saw it leave? The version people remember best comes later because it plays like a film. A wagon at night, a crate, a rail line heading east. Before that legend starts rolling, only the ink moves. The bones that left town on a midnight train. In late December 1868, the Sauk Rapids Sentinel printed a story from central Minnesota that sounded less like rumor than inventory. Quarrymen for the Sauk Rapids Water Power Company were cutting stone for a dam across the Mississippi River. They had uncovered what the paper called the remains of a human being of gigantic stature. Not roughly, exactly. The bones were said to lie 7 feet below the surface, under a layer of rock, inside a quadrangular grave cut into solid granite, 12 feet long, 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep. The skeleton itself measured 10 feet 9.5 inches from crown to sole. The head circumference was 31.5 inches. The chest was 59.5. With what the paper called a reasonable amount of flesh, the man would have weighed about 900 pounds. Those numbers are the bait. They do not read like gossip. They read like somebody stood there with a tape. Later accusations against the Smithsonian lean hard on stories that feel archival. So this one becomes useful far beyond Minnesota. A 19th century account described a skeleton estimated at 10 feet near the Mississippi River. Later retellings said the remains were transported east and sold to a circus. If that happened, there should be traces. A shipping notice, a station agent's record, a circus handbill boasting of a petrified giant from Minnesota, a named witness who saw the crate loaded. Instead, the trail goes quiet almost at once. The original report lavishes attention on the body and gives almost none to custody. No coroner, no doctor, no county official, no church burial committee suddenly alarmed by a 12-foot grave under granite. No mention of the remains being examined by anyone whose name can be checked outside the column itself. In a small river town in 1868, with a discovery this bizarre, that absence is not a side detail. It shapes the whole story. There is also a stranger problem inside the wording. The report insists the skeleton was completely petrified. That makes the find sound older, heavier, more impossible. It also makes the account harder to trust, in the same way frontier wonder stories often tip too far when they add one flourish too many. Human bone can mineralize, bone can stain, bone can become fragile or stone-like in description, but a fully petrified 10-foot, 9.5-inch body in a rectangular grave hacked into solid granite is not ordinary burial language. It is spectacle language, dressed up as excavation. The geology matters as much as the anatomy. The strongest move in the article is not the height, it is the granite. Granite sounds ancient. Granite sounds sealed away before history. Granite rules out an ordinary grave robber, a recent burial, an easy explanation. It also makes the scene feel composed. A grave cut into solid rock, beneath rock, containing a giant, measured neatly to the half-inch. The image is almost too perfectly built for later giant anthologies. Almost. Once the story leaves Sauk Rapids, it starts losing the one thing that could have anchored it: people. Later retellings love the disappearance. They say the bones were taken away, transported east, sold, hidden, lost to a circus, or funneled toward the great museums that swallowed every curiosity of the age. This is where the Smithsonian enters by implication rather than evidence. If giant remains kept turning up in local papers for more than a century, why can almost none of them be found today? A missing specimen feels like an answer, but for Sauk Rapids, there is no established specimen inventory linking the reported bones to the Smithsonian, or a named circus collection. None. The train story survives because removal explains absence so neatly. It does not survive because documentation supports it. You can test that directly. Railroad freight records for a single sensational shipment should leave names, dates, destinations, or at least a station trail. 19th century circus catalogs were not shy about promoting oddities. A petrified giant from the Mississippi would not have been buried in 6-point type. It would have been painted on canvas. Yet the Sauk Rapids giant enters later lore without the ordinary paperwork of a thing that was handled, sold, displayed, or accessioned. There is another clue in the way the report behaves. Real local discoveries usually produce local follow-up. A second article, a correction, a viewing, arguments over ownership. Visitors arriving by sleigh to see the bones. Here, the story's afterlife is mostly reprinting. It grows stronger by being copied, not by being corroborated. The article's exactness preserves its authority, even while the chain of custody never appears. That is how newspaper amplification hardens into evidence, not because new facts arrive, but because the old phrases keep sounding official every time they are repeated. The midnight train starts to look less like a witnessed event and more like a patch for a broken story. There is a dramatic discovery and no specimen, so something has to carry it away. A circus bought it, a collector shipped it, a museum swallowed it. The train fixes the emotional gap. It does not fix the historical one. By the end of the trail, the scene falls apart in full daylight. No excavation record, no coroner's note, no contemporaneous local follow-up confirming examination of a 10-foot, 9.5-inch body. No shipping record for the bones, no circus catalog naming the exhibit, no established Smithsonian accession tying Sauk Rapids to a giant skeleton. Just a December 1868 newspaper story, a granite grave, and a load that never reaches the depot on paper. Number 8. The photograph that changed size. In 1928, a photograph from Santa Catalina Island seemed to settle the argument in a single glance. A skeleton lies in the ground. A man crouches beside it. The bones look enormous. Not newspaper enormous, not rumor enormous, just there, visible, physical. Your eye measures them before any caption appears. If you were trying to understand why so many giant stories survive when the bones do not, this is the image that makes people stop digging. The proof seems to sit inside the frame. The man in that frame was Ralph Glidden, born in 1881, dead in 1968, one of the most notorious excavators in Channel Islands archaeology. In the 1920s and early 1930s, he turned Catalina into a place where burial grounds, museum display, tourism, and self-promotion blurred together. Later reporting says he dug through more than 800 burial sites on Catalina and other Channel Islands under museum sponsorship. He also ran his own Catalina Museum of Island Indians. There, the dead were not treated as quiet evidence. They were arranged as spectacle. One account says bones were even built into the architecture itself. Before the giant claim even appears, the setting is already unstable. Part dig, part show, part graveyard. Then came the story that traveled furthest. In 1928, Glidden said he had uncovered a 138-pound soapstone urn containing the crouched skeleton of a royal princess. Elsewhere, he claimed a male skeleton measuring 7 feet 8 inches, with a spear blade lodged in his side. He did not present these as isolated burials. He folded them into a larger story about a prehistoric race of giant, fair-skinned, blue-eyed Native Americans. That claim could jump from island gossip into national myth in a heartbeat. It had everything: size, mystery, race theory, violence, royalty, and an institution-shaped villain waiting in the background. Near the center of that legend sat the picture. The giant existed because the camera stood in the right place. Seen cold, the image is persuasive. There is a trench. There are bones. There is a human body beside them for comparison. That is how archaeological photographs earn trust. But the camera can borrow that trust and spend it on a trick. If the camera is low, if the skeleton sits nearer the lens, if the man is set slightly farther back, and if there is no measuring rod, no north arrow, no site tag, no field number, no full body plan view, scale stops being documentation. It becomes theater. A long bone in the foreground swells. The crouching excavator shrinks. The grave turns into a stage trick built from dirt and distance. Here, the visual evidence itself is doing the work of the myth. It is not just a disputed description, not just a missing specimen. It is an image that seems to prove giant stature while withholding the one thing that would let anyone test it cleanly. The Smithsonian enters the story in a stranger way than the accusation suggests. Not by hiding Glidden from history, but by preserving part of him. The National Museum of the American Indian Archive holds 536 Ralph Glidden negatives, dated from 1919 to 1923. So the trail does not begin with disappearance. It begins with survival. Negatives, archives, a catalog entry, material that can be examined. But preserving photographs is not the same as validating the claims attached to them. In that gap, the Catalina legend found room to breathe. Once the image circulated, the caption took over. A burial became a giant burial. Disturbed remains became a lost race. An excavator with commercial incentives became an authority. Catalina became a machine for manufacturing belief. Tourists could visit the island. They could hear the stories near the place where the stories were supposed to have happened. The museum gave rumor walls, cases, and admission. It is easier to doubt a clipping than a room full of bones, even when the room has been arranged by the same man selling the tale. Later scholarship pulled the scene back to earth. Forensic work and repatriation records treated many of these remains not as vanished evidence of giants, but as real indigenous burials that had been excavated, mishandled, exhibited, and mixed with exaggeration. The broader history of collecting on Catalina was tangled up with speculative racial ideas already circulating at the time, and Glidden knew exactly how to speak that language. He did not need to invent every burial. He only needed to frame ordinary human remains inside an extraordinary narrative. That is harder to catch because some of the underlying material is real. One sharp point remains. Did Glidden ever produce independent, reliable documentation for the specific 7-foot 8-inch skeleton that can be verified today? Not a publicity line, not a dramatic retelling, a proper record. So far, that figure looks far more stable in legend than in archaeological documentation. Recreate the famous image at ground level, and the giant starts to contract. A body length in the foreground can look monstrous when the only comparison is a man placed behind it, and no scale bar pins down the lie. A trustworthy archaeological photograph would do the opposite. It would flatten the drama. It would include measured scale, provenience, field identification, multiple angles, and enough context for another researcher to check what the camera saw. Glidden's image became famous because it looked official while behaving like advertising. The archives preserved negatives. Later records identify indigenous human remains. On the ground, the photograph that seemed to show a giant was teaching the eye how to be fooled. Number 7. The skulls that were deliberately changed. In January 1913, Alice Hrdlicka arrived in Peru and found skulls that looked impossible. Some had been trephined, cut open during life, and the person survived. Some were reshaped by disease. Others swept backward in long, smooth arcs, with compressed foreheads and stretched vaults, as if they belonged to something not quite human. For anyone already searching for proof of a lost giant race, this looked like evidence before the measuring even began. These skulls are genuinely unusual for a completely human reason. Hrdlicka was not a fringe collector or a tabloid fabulist. From 1904 to 1941, he dominated physical anthropology at the Smithsonian's National Museum. In 1914, he published his Peru report, 69 pages in Volume 61, Issue 18 of Smithsonian Miscellaneous Collections. He described exactly the kind of material later giant lore loves to recycle. Altered crania, surgical openings, pathological remains, burials with bones that did not look normal to an untrained eye. His conclusion went the other way. These were not the heads of giants. They were human heads deliberately changed in childhood. The giant story does not need fake bones. It only needs real bones with a dramatic enough shape to outrun their context. The mechanism is brutally simple. In infancy, the cranial bones are still growing. The sutures have not fully fused. Pressure can redirect the skull's shape. Binding, boards, wrapped textiles, cradle pressure. Different methods produce different results. A head can be flattened, sloped, widened, or pulled into the unmistakable elongated profile that floods documentaries and conspiracy feeds. In a glass case, it can look alien, but skull shape is not species by itself. It is definitely not height. Modern work on Smithsonian-held Peruvian collections makes that even harder to ignore. One study examined 608 pre-Hispanic crania from roughly 1300 to 1500 CE, representing 8 coastal and highland regions of Peru. These were not mysterious one-offs drifting through rumor. They were accessioned, measured, compared, and studied as a population. Within that population, elongation appears exactly where archaeology would expect it, among known practices of artificial cranial modification, not as a hidden branch of humanity in museum drawers. This is usually where the myth shifts. If the skull is real, then the claim becomes that the museum changed the label. The Smithsonian received evidence of giants and reclassified it into harmless anthropology. That only works if the bones carry the anatomy of a different kind of human and were somehow talked back into normality. These skulls do not do that. They look extreme from the outside, yes. But proving a distinct giant race requires far more. Unusual overall stature documented from long bones, consistent proportions across multiple skeletons, secure excavation context, repeatable measurements, and traits that cannot be explained by known cultural modification. An elongated cranium gives you one spectacular variable. A giant claim needs an entire body. Peru is only half the story. North America produced the same visual trap under different names: low forehead skulls, head flattening, lambdoid deformation, cradleboard shaping. Across the eastern United States, Chaco Canyon, Wisconsin, Missouri, Oregon, Alaska, and the Southwest, anthropologists described cranial forms that a modern viral post can strip from context in seconds. Remove the burial number, the site report, and the comparative notes, and only the silhouette survives. Long head, sloped forehead. The leap comes fast, giant, hidden, suppressed. The older records, flawed as they often are, point somewhere less cinematic and more revealing. The Smithsonian did collect indigenous remains. It did catalog them inside a colonial-era science obsessed with measurement. It did help build a system in which skulls were sorted, compared, and too often treated as racial evidence. That history is real. It is ugly enough without inventing a vanished species. The deeper distortion was not simply that museums hid elongated skulls. Museums helped train people to read shape as destiny. You can see that habit in the way these remains still circulate. A photograph appears online with no site, no specimen number, no excavation date, no scale, no chain of custody. The skull is dramatic, so the explanation arrives already loaded. Giant, hybrid, non-human. Archaeology works the other way around. The more extraordinary the shape, the more ordinary the paperwork has to be. Provenance first, context first, comparative anatomy first. Without that, the image behaves exactly like Glidden's photographs did. Official at a glance, unstable under pressure. Smithsonian collections from Peru point in the opposite direction. They are exactly the kind of holdings giant narratives claim should not exist if the institution had really erased the evidence. The crania are there. Researchers still study them. Educational materials have discussed artificial deformation openly for years. One Smithsonian bulletin on moche material even notes that about half of the studied skulls floated. The unusual shape was never the secret. What mattered was how easily that shape could be sold to the public as biological impossibility. Picture the original scene again. A long, narrow skull laid on a table. The back of the cranium sweeping farther out than the modern eye expects. The forehead compressed. The profile severe enough to look like proof. If that skull belonged to a separate race of giants, the rest of the skeleton would have to say it too. The limb bones would need to scale up. The joints would need to match. The pelvis, the vertebrae, the muscle attachments, the dental pattern, the entire body would have to move outside the human range together. The record keeps showing something else. A human skull altered early, curated later, measured often, and placed in a drawer with a tag. Number 6. The coffin beneath the quarry. Soldiers were digging a pit for a powder magazine on Lompoc Rancho, California, in 1833, when they struck a bed of cemented gravel. That is how the story usually opens, not with a skeleton, with work, with uniforms, with a routine military job so ordinary it sounds copied from a report. They break through the hard layer. Under it sits a coffin-like container, sealed in stone or gravel, 12 feet long. Inside lies a man the same length. Some versions add more: shells, stone tools, and thin quartz sheets cut with symbols. The rumor works because it arrives dressed as evidence. Lompoc, California, 1833. Soldiers, a powder magazine, a sealed burial, numbers, place names, logistics. It sounds less like folklore than paperwork. Then the trail starts to thin. The quartz inscription should be the easiest part to test. If marked sheets were really found with the burial, something should follow from them. A plate, a sketch, a transcription, an authenticated translation. At minimum, a museum note saying what the symbols looked like. Instead, the story drifts through modern giant skeleton lists, like a body passed from hand to hand in the dark. You can see why it spread. Coastal California, 1833. Picks hit compacted gravel. The pit is meant to hold powder, not disturb the dead. Then the ground opens into something built, not a loose grave, a container. Long enough to make every man there stop and look again. That is the hook inside this burial. Not only a giant, but a lost civilization. A sarcophagus suggests masonry, planning, ritual, writing. One oversized skeleton becomes an entire culture. This account matters to the larger question running through the whole video. If the Smithsonian really received giant skeletons and unusual human remains for more than a century, this is the kind of case that should leave marks in the record. Not only bones, but objects. Not only objects, but descriptions, especially inscriptions. When the search moves from image to source, the names disappear. No named soldier, no officer, no unit, no fort, no contemporary field note tied to the event, no accession number linking Lompoc to a Smithsonian specimen. What survives is the scene itself, polished by repetition. The burial that promised a giant and a lost civilization becomes, somewhere down the line, item number 6 on giant discovery lists. One word does a lot of work here: sarcophagus. It gives the find an old-world grandeur, as if Roman stonecraft had turned up under a California quarry face. Without a contemporary archaeological description, though, that word may tell you less about the object in the ground than about the person retelling it. A gravel-sealed cavity becomes a tomb. A tomb becomes a monument. A monument becomes evidence for a vanished race. So the chapter narrows to one person's story. Not a soldier in 1833, because the circulating account never gives us one. It narrows to the unknown compiler who gave this scene its modern shape. Somebody locked the details into a form built to last. Lompoc Rancho, powder magazine, cemented gravel, 12-foot coffin, 12-foot skeleton, quartz inscriptions, a perfect packet of specifics, precise enough to sound checkable, vague enough to resist checking. By now, that rhythm is familiar. Real archaeology usually gets more solid as you approach it. Names appear, measurements sharpen, collections lead somewhere. This story moves the other way. The closer you get, the more it sounds like a late echo of itself. A hard contrast sits in plain view. The Smithsonian's own California repatriation case materials show what documented human remains look like once they enter institutional custody. Catalog entries, provenience data, consultation history, legal status, inventories, case-by-case review, dry paperwork, dense paperwork, hard to read on screen. But that is what authenticity looks like after a burial becomes a collection. The Lompoc giant has none of it. The quartz sheets fare worst of all. They are the one feature that should have escaped the usual problem of lost bone. Yet no surviving plate has surfaced, no published drawing with secure provenance, no authenticated translation, no museum photograph of inscribed quartz tied to Lompoc Rancho, no scientific discussion of the signs as an epigraphic problem. For the most testable object in the entire report, the documentary footprint is effectively zero. That absence matters. Inscriptions are stubborn things. Bones can be misplaced. Measurements can be exaggerated. A coffin can be misdescribed. Symbols cut into quartz invite copying. Antiquarians sketch them. Newspapers print them. Collectors argue over alphabets and origins. Even frauds usually produce more evidence at that stage, because fake writing wants to be seen. Here, there is not even that. So the scene stays fixed where the rumor needs it most, under the quarry, at the instant of discovery, before a single accountable person has to touch it. Smithsonian Magazine has since stated the broader accusation plainly, calling the idea that the institution hid evidence of giant humans a myth that never had a shred of truth. That does not settle every vanished bone story in this video. Some disappearances are real, some records do go cold. In Lompoc, the break comes earlier. The claim does not lead to a lost specimen. It fails before the specimen stage. The detail that should have been easiest to preserve is the one that vanishes completely. No plates, no drawings, no authenticated translations of the supposed quartz inscriptions. Number 5. The collection number that goes nowhere. In the summer of 1840, in the limestone cliffs of Murphy's Valley, a group of hunters squeezed through an opening so small it was barely a crawl space. James Newman was with them. On the south branch of the Warrior River in Blount County, Alabama, the passage opened into a dry chamber. In that chamber lay the dead. Skulls, loose bones, shell beads, wooden bowls, copper tools, netting, and long wooden containers cut from black and white walnut logs. By the time the story reached print, there were said to be 8 or 10 of those containers, and 12 or 15 human skulls around them. In 1892, Frank Burns turned that Alabama cave into a formal Smithsonian record. Not a rumor, not a newspaper flourish, a government report, the Crump Burial Cave. Burns named the landowner, William Crump. He named the discoverer, James Newman. He copied details that had already aged for half a century and placed them into the National Museum's paper trail. The point under this whole story is simple. If the Smithsonian received giant skeletons and unusual human remains for more than a century, why can almost none of them be found today? Crump's cave is the hardest version of that problem. Here, the institution is not lurking behind hearsay, it is on the page. Burns described one wooden piece as about 7.5 feet long, 18 to 20 inches wide, and 6 to 7 inches deep. Read fast, that sounds like exactly the kind of number a giant story wants. 7.5 feet, a coffin, human remains, Smithsonian. But Burns did something later retellings usually do not. He compared the object not to an oversized casket built for a monstrous body, but to a dugout canoe, a hollowed trough, a log container, something shaped by a woodworking tradition as much as by the person placed inside it. That word matters. The missing item is repeatedly called a coffin, and coffin carries its own size implication. It makes the chamber sound like evidence of gigantic dead. But if the original description points to a dugout-like trough, the object changes shape in your mind. The dimensions stay the same, the meaning does not. That is where the inflation starts. Burns was not writing like a conspiracist. He was writing like a 19th century museum man, trying to sort a local discovery into an Aboriginal burial context. In his account, the cave was not a hidden vault of impossible humans. It was a mortuary deposit. The skulls were human skulls. The tools and ornaments fit native burial practice as he understood it. The long walnut containers belonged to that scene, but not as proof of a separate race. The Smithsonian publication survives in plain sight, searchable and citable, sitting there under the exact kind of institutional header that suppression stories usually claim was erased. The object itself is another matter. At some point, materials from Crump's cave were sent to the Smithsonian. Later inquiries got an answer that was ordinary and maddening. Records indicated receipt, but the specimens could not be located. That sentence keeps stories like this alive. Now there is a documented paper trail and a missing physical object, not a legend with no accession, a receipt without a body you can pull from storage. Discipline matters here. Poor cataloging is not the same as deliberate destruction. 19th century collections were moved, renumbered, mislabeled, split between departments, loaned, repacked, and sometimes left under standards no modern registrar would defend for 5 minutes. A specimen can disappear inside that machinery without anyone staging a cover-up. So when later advocates point to inaccessible storage, or to claims that some materials were difficult to reach because of asbestos contamination, that still does not get you to giant skeletons destroyed in secret. It gets you to a museum record that failed the modern expectation of traceability. Stand inside that gap for a second. On one side is the official page. 1840, James Newman, William Crump, walnut troughs, skulls, beads, copper, netting. On the other is the shelf that should settle the argument, and does not. No confidently matched trough. No specimen number a researcher can follow cleanly from Burns's description to a surviving object in a drawer. The institution acknowledged the find. The institution absorbed the report. Somewhere between receiving and recovering, the trail frays. So who made the coffin claim that later grew teeth? The answer is smaller and stranger than the myth. The original correspondence in Burns's publication used burial language, but the inflation came in layers. The excavators found long, hollowed wooden containers in a burial cave, so burial terms entered the description naturally. Burns preserved that mortuary framing, but he also cut against the giant reading by likening the piece to a dugout canoe. Later advocates kept the coffin and dropped the canoe. They kept the 7.5-foot number and let the context evaporate. The word did not begin as a secret Smithsonian confession of giants. It began as a rough burial description for a trough in a native cave context, then hardened into something more dramatic after the fact. The failure sits in plain view, not in a fantasy archive of 10-foot skeletons, and not in a clean institutional defense either. It is documentary and physical at once, a recoverable publication, an indicated receipt, and no recoverable specimen securely matched to the most disputed object. Officially, the record says Crump's cave was an Aboriginal burial site with trough-like containers. In Alabama, men crawled into a chamber full of the dead and pulled out something long enough for later generations to call a coffin. The Smithsonian preserved the description. The object is what slipped away. Number 4. The theory that decided who could build America. If the catalog trail is incomplete, what disappeared first here? The bones or the builders? In 1878, Smithsonian Secretary Joseph Henry sent out a circular across the United States, asking for information on Indian mounds and archaeological remains. It sounds administrative, dry, almost harmless, but those envelopes arrived in the middle of one of the most charged arguments in 19th century America. The Ohio and Mississippi valleys were covered in earthworks, embankments, burial mounds, geometric enclosures stretching hundreds of feet. Many white writers had already decided the people living on that land could not possibly have made them. So they supplied other builders: Phoenicians, Israelites, Vikings, Toltecs, a vanished, civilized race. Almost anyone would do, as long as the answer stayed safely separate from living native nations, with actual claims to history, land, and achievement. That accusation sits at the center of this part of the story. Not that the Smithsonian boxed up giant skeletons in secret vaults, but that Smithsonian-era archaeology helped erase evidence by deciding in advance who was allowed to have built America. Once that idea takes hold on paper, Every later missing bone starts to look intentional. Then the record shifts. In 1879, the Bureau of Ethnology was created at the Smithsonian under John Wesley Powell. A year later, the institution was no longer just collecting rumors and local testimony. It was building a federal system for classifying the indigenous past. By early 1882, Powell put Cyrus Thomas in charge of the Division of Mound Exploration. Thomas did not arrive with a shovel and one grand theory. He came with assistants, correspondence, site notes, artifact comparisons, burial data, and a mandate to work systematically across the eastern United States. That word matters, systematically. The lost race story had thrived on spectacle. An unusual skull here, a dramatic earthwork there, a newspaper paragraph that gained 6 inches every time the burial changed hands. Thomas's crews worked differently. Graves against graves, pottery against pottery, copper ornaments against copper ornaments, earthwork forms against historical accounts of peoples documented in the Southeast and Mississippi Valley. They were not chasing the strangest specimen. They were pulling hundreds of separate claims into one evidence file. In that process, the builders could disappear before the bones did. For decades, the easiest story for much of the country was that the mounds came from a superior vanished people. That left living native communities looking like late intruders in their own homelands. It was politically useful. If the monuments belonged to someone extinct, dispossession could dress itself up as inheritance. Powell's bureau moved in a different direction, though not for purely innocent reasons. It treated native peoples as the proper subjects of scientific classification. It also claimed the authority to define their past for them. This was not a melodramatic cover-up. It was narrower, colder, and documentary. The Smithsonian could dismantle one racist myth while still consolidating federal control over indigenous history, land, and remains. By 1884 and 1885, the Bureau's annual reporting described systematic mound operations east of the Rocky Mountains. Those reports contain the texture conspiracy stories usually skip: measurements, excavation notes, object descriptions, localities, comparisons, not treasure hunt language, paperwork, piles of it. Then, in 1894, Thomas published the Massive Synthesis, his report on the mound explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology, running from page 3 to page 730 in the 12th annual report. More than 700 pages is not what a secret burial of evidence looks like. It looks like a state-scale argument. Thomas's conclusion was blunt. The mound builders were not a lost white race, not stray Israelites, not Old World colonists. They were ancestors of Native American peoples, especially groups historically known in the Southeast and Mississippi Valley. Something was buried here, but not the revelation giant hunters usually mean. The Smithsonian's late 19th century archaeology helped bury diffusionism, the idea that indigenous societies needed outsiders to explain complexity on this continent. Giant lore often feeds on the same instinct. If a mound is impressive enough, the builder must have been someone else. Taller, wiser, whiter, more mysterious. Anyone but the people whose descendants were still alive to be ignored. One loose wire in the archive keeps the suspicion alive. The Smithsonian's own finding aid for the Division of Mound Exploration notes that some administrative correspondence was transferred in 1960 to what is now the National Anthropological Archives. It also states something genuinely important. The printed 1894 report contains important differences from the original notes and is sometimes less detailed. That matters. Publication meant selection, compression, interpretation. Some things in the raw record did not survive into the polished federal version with the same level of detail. That documentary gap is still not the same thing as a hidden race of giants. It supports a more grounded claim. Smithsonian archaeology in this period was shaped by theory, bureaucracy, and the political uses of science. It could amplify mound builder fascination in one decade and dismantle it in the next. It could preserve records and flatten them at the same time. It could correct the fantasy of a vanished, civilized race, while still speaking over native people in the process. What it does not do, on the evidence we actually have, is turn missing detail into proof that the institution possessed a separate giant population and quietly removed it from history. Cyrus Thomas closed the central argument in 1894 in terms that were less cinematic and far more consequential. The works, he wrote, belong to the Indian race. Number 3. The law that leaves one door open. On November 16, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed NAGPRA, the law most people now reach for when they try to track what American museums did with Native American dead and sacred objects. So, the natural move is simple. Open the NAGPRA trail, search the museum, expect the record to appear. And then, in the definitions section, the trail abruptly splits. In 25 U.S.C. Section 3001(8), museum does not include the Smithsonian Institution. For an investigator, that one line changes the search itself. You can open the right law, use the right keywords, and still conclude the Smithsonian had nothing. Not because nothing was there, but because the search was pointed at the wrong archive. That is why the dates matter, and why each one carries a different risk. In 1989, Congress passed the National Museum of the American Indian Act, creating a Smithsonian-specific repatriation path before NAGPRA even existed. That matters because some Smithsonian holdings were already moving under a separate process before the public learned to treat NAGPRA as the master key. In 1990, when NAGPRA became the general rule for federal agencies and federally funded museums, the Smithsonian stayed outside that definition of museum, so its compliance record did not have to appear in the same place. Then, in 1996, Congress tightened the Smithsonian framework with a more detailed structure and a summary deadline. That deadline matters because a summary filed at a high level could become the last easy public breadcrumb before an item was reclassified, transferred, or returned. The problem was not lawlessness. The problem was that the public map pointed to one archive, while the Smithsonian trail ran through another. Under NAGPRA, the path is comparatively visible. Items excavated or discovered on federal or tribal lands after November 16, 1990, fell under 25 U.S.C. Section 3002(a). Existing collections triggered duties to inventory, summarize, consult, and, under Section 3005, repatriate when the standards were met. For an outsider, those sections matter because they create expectations. Notices, inventories, consultation records, agency files, museum compliance paperwork. If a person is missing from one of those channels, an investigator notices. Set the Smithsonian beside that expectation, and the first danger comes into focus. A searcher can treat a clean NAGPRA result as proof of Smithsonian absence. That mistake sounds small, but it can poison the entire investigation from the first step. Leads get dropped. Names get dismissed. A collection is judged empty because it is absent from the wrong ledger. The second risk is sharper: false accusation. Congress gave the Smithsonian its own duties in 20 U.S.C. Section 80Q-9A. It had to prepare a written summary by December 31, 1996, and it had to return certain items once affiliation was established. If you ignore that separate paper trail, you can turn an archival mismatch into a public charge. A researcher checks NAGPRA databases, finds nothing, and says the Smithsonian erased, hid, or destroyed the evidence. But a Smithsonian summary, accession file, consultation trail, or return record may show something less dramatic and more complicated. The material was documented, reviewed, and handled under a different process. That is not a minor distinction. Once a false claim hardens in public, every later correction sounds like backpedaling. The search error becomes a reputational event. Now the stakes rise again, because the third risk is not just a bad accusation. It is loss of interpretive control over what happened to old remains. Imagine two researchers checking the same old claim. One searches published NAGPRA notices and finds nothing under the Smithsonian name. The other digs into Smithsonian-specific records and finds an accession history, a committee file, a consultation record, or a return. Same underlying material, two incompatible stories. But now, add a harder complication. Old remains are often badly described. Measurements vary. Provenance is thin. Labels change. A summary may be broad, while a later action may be specific. In that situation, the real question is no longer simply, was it there? It becomes, was it repatriated, reclassified, transferred, or destroyed? And can we still tell the difference? For ordinary repatriation work, that is already difficult. For giant skeleton claims, it is much worse. Those claims often survive through fragmentary newspaper accounts, field notes, collector lore, and descriptions made before modern standards existed. If such material ever entered Smithsonian custody, proving what it was would require matching old accession ledgers, physical descriptions, internal correspondence, consultation files, and any later return documentation. If chain of custody breaks at any point, if a box number changes, if remains are summarized only generally, if associated paperwork lives in a separate committee file, then the investigator may lose the ability to tell whether a controversial set of remains was lawfully repatriated, absorbed into a broader classification, or simply made untraceable by age and paperwork drift. That is the real escalation. First, the wrong search can create a false absence. Second, that false absence can become a false public accusation. Third, in the oldest and weakest cases, fragmented records can make it genuinely hard to distinguish return from reclassification, or either of those from effective disappearance in the paper trail. Then comes the hardest consequence of all. Lawful repatriation can reduce public visibility. Once remains or associated items are returned, what stays public may be only a summary, an old accession note, or a committee finding never designed for modern online scrutiny. For controversial cases, oversized remains, disputed identifications, culturally sensitive material with thin documentation, the surviving record may be too sparse to settle later arguments with confidence. So the legal clarification is real, but it matters only because it changes the investigation. The Smithsonian was not outside repatriation. It was outside NAGPRA's definition of museum, while still subject to its own statutory return process under 20 U.S.C. Section 80Q-9A. That means the key evidence may sit in different files, under different labels, with different levels of public visibility. And that leaves one unsettling problem unresolved. If the most controversial old cases were never cleanly accessioned, were summarized only at a high level by the 1996 deadline, or were returned through Smithsonian-specific files tied to early collections and undocumented remains, then the thing that becomes hardest to verify is not a modern inventory entry. It is the older chain of custody behind it, the buried paper trail that can vanish from a simple public search long before anyone knows which name, number, or box to ask for. Number 2. The museum war over impossible artifacts. In July 1944, on the edge of Acambaro in Guanajuato, a German-born hardware merchant named Waldemar Julsrud began buying clay figures from local diggers near El Toro Hill. It sounds like the kind of discovery that should leave a solid trail. No missing crate, no vanished shipment, just a flood of objects. Julsrud kept buying, and his house filled up. The total was said to be more than 33,000 figurines, ceramic animals, human forms, monsters, and the pieces that set everything on fire, figures some people read as dinosaurs. A collection that large changes the standard immediately. If the Smithsonian really rejected evidence on this scale because it was too dangerous, the accusation needs more than rumor behind it. It needs provenance, repeatable testing, access records, a chain showing where the pieces came from, when, and under what conditions. A collection that big is too big to hide, and too controversial to settle with a headline. The myth spread fast because it had every ingredient forbidden archaeology feeds on. A provincial Mexican town, a private collector, tens of thousands of artifacts outside a major museum, and images that seem to show human beings looking at prehistoric reptiles with their own eyes. If that were true, it would not tweak a museum label. It would blow up chronology. The Smithsonian's public human origins material accepts figurines with deep antiquity elsewhere, some at least 35,000 years old, but not Acambaro. So the charge was never that the institution seized these objects and locked them away. The charge was narrower and harder to test. Rejection itself became the burial. In 1952, an archaeologist arrived with a far less dramatic explanation. Charles de Peso of the Amarind Foundation came to Acambaro. He watched 2 excavators work. He handled the objects himself. Then he concluded they were modern. His objections were plain and physical. He checked the crevices for old dirt packed deep inside and did not find it. He looked for worn breaks and did not find them. He looked for the missing fragments you would expect from genuinely ancient broken ceramics and did not find those either. What he saw were fresh-looking surfaces, as if age had been claimed but never physically lived. Then there is one detail so ordinary it is easy to miss. The reported payment was 1 peso per figurine, 1 peso for each piece. That creates a production system almost overnight. Pay for quantity, and quantity arrives. That does not mean every object must be fake by definition. It means the pressure runs one way only. Make more. Make them fast. Make them different. Make them strange enough to keep the buyer interested. In that setting, a growing mountain of objects is not automatic proof of authenticity. It can just as easily be proof of output. The story survived because laboratory dates entered the picture and changed the argument. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Charles Hapgood helped revive Acambaro by promoting tests that seemed to pull the figurines back into deep time. Radiocarbon numbers were cited: 3,590 plus or minus 100 years before present, 6,480 plus or minus 170, 3,060 plus or minus 120. Thermoluminescence work, including testing done between 1969 and 1972 at the Penn Museum's Applied Science Center for Archaeology, was presented as if the lab had finally outrun the skeptics. At that point, the collection was no longer introduced as odd or suggestive, it was introduced as dated. Now the fight moves from spectacle to custody. What exactly was dated? A figurine itself, or organic material associated with it? Did it come from a secure excavation context, or from the orbit of a collection already assembled through buying, sorting, and retelling? Picture a shelf loaded with thousands of objects. Then a few lab numbers arrive. Numbers feel solid because they always do, but a date only dates its sample. If the sample is not securely tied to the object, and the object is not securely tied to a documented find spot, the certainty belongs to the measurement, not to the story built on top of it. That is how Acambaro turned into a museum war without becoming a museum victory. The pro-authenticity side could point to tests and say the establishment ignored science. Skeptics could point to condition, incentives, and context and say the science never had a stable target. The Smithsonian's absence here matters in a narrower way than the legend suggests. Its public materials do not treat Acambaro as a suppressed treasure. They leave it outside the archaeological record altogether. That is an institutional judgment. It is not confiscation. In 1976, the dating claims took a direct hit. A study published in American Antiquity, Thermoluminescent Dating and the Monsters of Acambaro, argued that the thermoluminescence results were invalid because the figurines produced abnormal signals. That does not prove every piece was made yesterday. It does remove the cleanest version of the headline. The lab did not settle the collection. The collection destabilized the lab. After that, the weak point was impossible to miss. More than 33,000 objects. A buyer paying by the piece. Early radiocarbon claims tied to associated material rather than secure archaeological context. Thermoluminescence promoted as decisive, then challenged as unreliable. No Smithsonian vault full of buried giants. No accepted place in the institution's human origins record either. Just shelves, numbers, and the same break in the chain of custody every time. Which exact figurine, from which exact hole, under whose exact record, was actually dated? Number 1. What the Smithsonian actually buried. In Washington, D.C., in 1879, the paper trail begins. Not in a sealed basement, not behind a courtroom order. In files. The Bureau of American Ethnology starts building what would become the Smithsonian's oldest archival repository. Over the next century, the institution does what bureaucracies do when they handle the dead. It writes things down. Accession slips, curator letters, field notes, specimen labels, permit files, photographs, later, repatriation paperwork. If giant skeletons were really received, buried, transferred, or destroyed for more than 100 years, this is where that contact should show. This is where the accusation has to hold. The opening question was never just whether newspapers printed giant bones. They did. The question was whether those bones entered an institution large enough, old enough, and paper heavy enough to leave a shadow. Where did the giants go? Into verified collections, into rumor, into ordinary human variation, or into fraud? Only 4 doors are left. By 1965, the Bureau of American Ethnology had merged administratively with the Smithsonian's Department of Anthropology. The records did not vanish in the process. They got thicker. In the Smithsonian Online Virtual Archives, the Department of Anthropology record group runs from 1828 to 1994, and is arranged into 28 major series. 28. That matters. Conspiracies like clean stories. Museums generate clutter. A real removal leaves traces in the wrong places. An inventory gap here, a letter there, an old label in a drawer no one meant to preserve. The Smithsonian's own modern language sharpens the issue. In a 2024 policy update, Directive 600 requires annual reporting and record-keeping for human remains, not covered by the National Museum of the American Indian Act. The institution states outright that it holds thousands of human remains in collections outside that law's coverage. Thousands. That is not folklore. It is a custody fact. Uncomfortable, documentable, ethically real. But it concerns human remains broadly, not a separate race of 10-foot people hidden under the mall. Now the ledger can be opened. Some cases go into the first pile. Verified remains. These are not mysterious. They are the opposite. Human remains were collected, studied, labeled, stored, and in many cases later routed into repatriation procedures. The early repatriation office files appear as their own series, from 1991 to 1994. On paper, you can watch the Smithsonian doing something the secret legends usually skip past. Returning the dead, slowly and under pressure, because law and ethics changed around collections that should never have been treated so casually in the first place. Some cases go into the second pile, plausible but unverified reports. This is where the strongest unresolved disappearances sit. A newspaper says bones were sent east. A local letter says a collection number once existed. A later inquiry says records indicate receipt, but the specimen cannot now be located. A trail starts, then it snaps. That is not nothing. Institutional opacity is a real criticism here. If an accession trail begins and then breaks, the break matters. It may reflect loss, poor cataloging, transfer, reclassification, contamination, or simple neglect. Museums misplace things. Large 19th century collections were not curated under modern standards. But a broken trail is still not the same as a proven giant skeleton destroyed in secret. Then there is the third pile, misidentified human variation. Human gigantism is real. Very tall individuals existed. A skeleton around 7 feet is extraordinary, but still biologically human. Old field estimates drift. Newspapers exaggerate. Measuring standards go missing. Sensational copy takes over. An unusual burial grows another 6 inches every time the story is retold. Add cranial modification, pathology, bad scale in photographs, or a witness who never handled the bones personally, and impossible starts sliding back toward unusual. Then the fourth pile, fraud. The internet's favorite piece of Smithsonian evidence does not come from a leaked federal archive or a Supreme Court order. It comes from fiction, repeated until it felt historical. The viral claim that the Smithsonian admitted destroying giant skeletons under pressure from a group called the AIAA collapses as soon as it meets the record. There was no such Supreme Court case. The named organization does not exist in the way the story requires. Smithsonian Magazine addressed it. Fact-checkers addressed it. Lead stories addressed it. The most famous confession in the entire legend is not suppressed evidence. It is a very successful myth in legal costume. Between a missing catalog entry and that myth, the picture becomes clear. The Smithsonian can legitimately be blamed for mishandling, obscuring, and too often retaining human remains collected under older archaeological and colonial practices. It can be blamed for records that are incomplete, difficult to navigate, or too thin to resolve every transfer and disappearance cleanly. When thousands of ancestors pass through a system this large, some losses, ambiguities, and administrative blind spots are not imaginary. They are the scandal. But the accusation changes shape the moment it reaches for giants. The surviving evidence audit does not produce a paper trail for a secret destruction program. It produces something more ordinary and more disturbing. A bureaucracy that documented a vast amount, documented it unevenly, and later had to reckon with what it had been allowed to keep. So where did the giants go? The verified cases became ordinary human remains in museum systems. The plausible cases remained plausible because the trail ends too early. The oversized cases often reduced to exceptional stature, pathology, or bad reporting. And the loudest confession of all turns out to be fabricated. The strongest unresolved disappearance is not proof of a hidden race. It is proof that missing records are corrosive. They let every rumor move into the space where evidence should have been. By the end, almost none of the famous giants can be found for the same reason almost all legends survive. Not because a vault is full, but because the chain breaks before the claim reaches a shelf. The Smithsonian's disappearance problem is real in some cases. Its silence has earned suspicion. But when the accusation is matched against accession records, archaeological standards, repatriation law, surviving collections, and the known frauds, the picture hardens. What the Smithsonian actually buried was not a civilization of giants. It was a century of human remains inside paperwork dense enough to expose the myth, and incomplete enough to keep it alive.